I never imagined I'd be the one writing a story about betrayal, much less living through it. I thought I had everything figured out. My name is David, and I've lived in Seattle for the last 15 years. A tech hub with a pulse of creativity, Seattle always felt like the perfect place to build a life. I worked as a software developer, climbing the ranks at a company that specialized in cybersecurity. In hindsight, I guess I should have been more suspicious, given my career was all about uncovering hidden threats, but I never expected betrayal to hit so close to home. My wife Sophie and I had been married for 9 years. We met during a rainy night at a small coffee shop in Pike Place Market, right by the famous gum wall. She was sitting by the window with her nose buried in a novel by Haruki Murakami. Her quiet intensity pulled me in instantly. We dated for 2 years before I proposed to her on a ferry ride to Bainbridge Island. She said yes without hesitation, and we spent the next several years building what felt like an ideal life. We bought a house in Capitol Hill, a cozy, 2-story craftsman-style home with a view of the city skyline. For years, everything seemed perfect. We didn't have kids by choice. Instead, we poured ourselves into our careers, traveled the world, and hosted dinners at our house with friends who were like family. Sophie was an editor for a local publishing house, working from home most days. It was an arrangement that made sense, given her flexible schedule and my long hours at the office. Looking back, I realize now how much freedom that gave her. Freedom I was blissfully unaware of. Things started to shift about a year ago. I didn't notice it at first. It was subtle. Sophie became more distant, distracted, like she was somewhere else entirely. She had always been quiet, but this was different. When I'd ask how her day was, I'd get vague answers, something about being tired or stressed from work. I chalked it up to the ebb and flow of life, to the ups and downs that come with being married for nearly a decade. But something was off, and I couldn't quite put my finger on it. One Saturday, everything changed. It was early September, the kind of crisp fall day that makes you forget Seattle's perpetual gray. We had plans to meet up with my best friend, Mark, and his wife, Lydia, at Gasworks Park for a picnic. They were our closest couple friends, the ones we'd taken weekend trips with, the ones who knew us best. As I packed the car, I noticed Sophie seemed anxious, checking her phone more than usual. She barely made eye contact with me all morning. At the park, Mark pulled me aside, his face unusually serious. "Dave, I need to talk to you about something," he said in a low voice. "It's about Sophie." I felt a cold knot form in my stomach. "What's going on?" He hesitated, glancing over at Sophie and Lydia, who were chatting by the picnic blanket. I wasn't sure if I should say anything, but I've been noticing some things. Sophie's been spending a lot of time with a guy at her gym. I'm not talking about friendly conversations. It seems more than that. I blinked, stunned. "What are you talking about? She doesn't even go to the gym that often." "She's been going more lately, at least according to Lydia. And this guy, Greg, I think his name is, has been showing up in her Instagram stories. You probably haven't seen it since you're not on there much, but Lydia showed me." I could feel my heart pounding in my chest. Sophie had always been into fitness, but I hadn't noticed any recent changes. I pulled out my phone, searching for her Instagram account. I rarely looked at it, figuring her posts were just random snapshots of our life or photos from the hikes she took on weekends. But there it was, a few photos of her at the gym, smiling, with a man next to her in some of them. A tall, athletic guy with an easy grin. The caption read, "Workout Partner of the Year. Thanks for pushing me to my limits, Greg." I tried to stay calm, but my mind was racing. Who the hell was Greg? I looked back over at Sophie, who was laughing with Lydia like nothing was wrong. Mark put a hand on my shoulder. "I don't want to jump to conclusions, Dave, but something doesn't feel right." I nodded, feeling numb. We finished the picnic, and I tried to act normal, though my mind was spinning. That night, after we got home, I confronted Sophie. I didn't want to believe it. Didn't want to think that the woman I had loved for so long could be hiding something from me. But I had to know. "Sophie, who's Greg?" I asked casually as we unpacked the picnic bag in the kitchen. She froze for a split second before recovering. "Oh, he's just a guy from the gym. We work out together sometimes." I studied her face, trying to read the truth beneath her words. "Just a guy from the gym? Mark said you've been spending a lot of time with him." Her expression changed, nervous, defensive. "What? Are you spying on me now? I didn't realize I needed to give you a daily rundown of who I spend time with." I hadn't expected that reaction. "I'm not spying, it feels like there's something you're not telling me." She sighed, avoiding my gaze as she emptied a bag of groceries onto the counter. "David, this is ridiculous. I work out with him, that's it. Can we not make a big deal out of this?" But it was a big deal. I could feel it in my gut. And as the days went on, I couldn't shake the growing suspicion that Sophie was hiding something far bigger than I wanted to admit. After that conversation with Sophie, the tension lingered. The easygoing rhythm of our life together, once so familiar, now felt offbeat. I tried to tell myself that maybe I was being paranoid. Maybe it really was nothing, just a guy from the gym. But the way she reacted that night, her sudden defensiveness, planted a seed of doubt I couldn't ignore. Days passed, and Sophie seemed to return to her normal self. She laughed at my jokes, we watched our usual Netflix shows, and she even suggested a spontaneous weekend hike up in the Cascades, a trip we'd been meaning to take for months. On the surface, everything looked fine, but underneath, that seed of doubt had started to grow roots. Every time she checked her phone, every time she left for the gym, I couldn't help but wonder, was there something more? I did something I'm not proud of. One night, while Sophie was in the shower, I grabbed her phone from the nightstand. My hands shook as I unlocked it. I had never snooped through her things before, never even thought about it. But this time, I needed answers. Her messages seemed innocent at first. Texts with friends, her mom, a few work emails. But then I saw it. Greg. His name wasn't buried deep in her phone, but right there in her recent contacts. There was a thread of messages between them, and though nothing outright incriminating jumped out, the tone was different. They were joking, teasing each other about their workouts, talking about meeting up for coffee after the gym. One message stood out. "Greg, you're killing it. We should grab drinks sometime, celebrate those gains." Sophie. "Haha, for sure. Just don't push me too hard or I'll never forgive you." Drinks. Why hadn't she mentioned that? I knew she went to the gym with him, but she never said anything about hanging out outside of it. And then there was the way she flirted, even if it was subtle. I put her phone down just before she came back into the bedroom, steam from the shower swirling around her like she was stepping out of some dream. She smiled at me, completely unaware that I had just crossed a line I couldn't undo. The next day, I met Mark for coffee. We met at Cafe Vita on Pike Street, a spot we'd been going to for years, ever since our college days. Mark could tell I was on edge, and after a few minutes of small talk, he cut right to the chase. "You talked to her?" he asked, stirring his espresso. "Yeah," I said, but she brushed it off, said Greg's just a guy from the gym. Mark leaned back in his chair, eyeing me. "You believe her?" "I don't know, man." I shook my head, feeling the weight of uncertainty. "I checked her phone last night. She's been texting him. There was nothing damning, but I don't know. There's something off about it." Mark frowned. "Texting him? Like what, just gym stuff?" "Mostly, but they're making plans to grab drinks." He paused, letting that sink in. "That's weird. Why wouldn't she tell you about that?" "That's what I keep asking myself." Mark drummed his fingers on the table, his expression serious. "Look, Dave, I've known Sophie for as long as you have. She's never struck me as the type to cheat. But people change. And sometimes we don't see it coming. I nodded, not sure what to say. The truth was, I didn't want to believe it. I didn't want to think that Sophie, my Sophie, could betray me like that. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized how much had changed between us in the last year. The distance, the secrets, the way she avoided certain questions, it all pointed to something I didn't want to confront. A week later, the situation came to a head. Sophie had been more withdrawn than ever, and one night she told me she was meeting a friend for dinner. I didn't ask which friend. I didn't have to. I knew she was meeting Greg. The paranoia had eaten away at me for too long. I decided to follow her. She left the house around 7 p.m., and I waited a few minutes before grabbing my jacket and heading to the car. I felt like a fool, a nervous wreck as I tailed her through the dark streets of Seattle. She drove to a small bar in Queen Anne Hill, a place we'd gone to a few times for drinks after work. I parked down the street, my heart pounding in my chest as I watched her go inside. I waited for 10 minutes, 15, and then I saw him. Greg. He walked into the bar like he owned the place. That same easy grin on his face that I'd seen in her Instagram stories. I watched them through the window. They sat in a corner booth laughing, their heads close together. They looked intimate. I wanted to storm in there, demand answers, but something stopped me. I needed more. I needed undeniable proof that something was happening between them. So I waited. After an hour, Greg stood up, hugged Sophie goodbye, and walked out of the bar alone. I watched Sophie for a few more minutes, hoping she'd leave too, but she didn't. Instead, she ordered another drink and sat there, scrolling through her phone. Just when I thought I couldn't take it anymore, something even more unexpected happened. Another man walked in. Tall, well-dressed, with salt and pepper hair. He approached Sophie's table, leaned down, and kissed her on the cheek. This wasn't Greg. My mind was spinning. Who was this guy? I had never seen him before, and yet there he was, kissing my wife like it was the most natural thing in the world. I watched as they talked, their body language comfortable, familiar. Sophie smiled at him in a way I hadn't seen in months. I couldn't hear what they were saying, but it was clear that this was more than just a friendly chat. I snapped a few photos on my phone, my hands shaking. I didn't know what I was going to do with them, but I needed proof. Something tangible to hold on to in case Sophie tried to deny what I was seeing with my own eyes. After what felt like an eternity, they both stood up, paid their tab, and left the bar together. I followed at a distance, watching as they walked down the street side by side, their hands almost touching. They stopped at a street corner, and then they kissed. Right there, under the streetlights of Queen Anne Hill, my wife kissed this stranger with more passion than I had seen from her in years. I felt sick. I wanted to scream, to run up to them and demand an explanation, but I couldn't move. I was frozen, watching my life fall apart in front of me. When Sophie came home later that night, she acted like everything was normal. She kissed me on the cheek, asked how my evening was, and then went to bed without a second thought. I sat there in the living room, staring at my phone. The photos of her and that man burned into my mind. I didn't sleep that night. I couldn't. The next morning, I confronted her. I didn't mention the bar, or Greg, or the mystery man. Instead, I simply asked her how her dinner was. She hesitated for a split second before answering. It was fine. Just caught up with an old friend. I could feel the rage boiling inside me. An old friend? Who? Just someone from work, she said casually, not meeting my eyes. I stood up, my heart pounding. Sophie, stop lying to me. She froze, her face pale. What are you talking about? I followed you last night, I said, my voice shaking. I saw everything. I saw you with Greg. I saw you with that other guy. Don't you dare lie to me." Her eyes widened, and for a moment I thought she might deny it. But then her shoulders slumped, and she let out a shaky breath. "David, I can explain." But I didn't want to hear her explanation. The betrayal was already too deep. Sophie stood there, visibly shaken, knowing there was no way to lie her way out of this one. Her eyes filled with tears as she started to speak. "David, I didn't want it to happen like this. It's not what you think." Her voice cracked, and for a moment I almost believed she was genuinely sorry. "Not what I think?" I snapped. "You've been sneaking around with Greg and some mystery man, kissing him under streetlights. What exactly is it that I'm not understanding?" Sophie took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. "It's complicated," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Greg and it wasn't serious, it was just flirting. Nothing physical ever happened." I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, anger rising with every word she said. "What about the other guy? The one you kissed?" Sophie flinched. "That's Peter," she said, her voice trembling. "He's someone I've been seeing for a few months. But it's not what you think, David. I didn't mean to hurt you. I don't know how I got here." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Months? She had been seeing this guy for months, behind my back, lying to me every single day. "How long, Sophie? How long have you been lying to me?" She wiped away a tear. "It started about 6 months ago. I wasn't looking for anything, it just happened. We met at a work event and I don't know. I felt things I hadn't felt in a long time." "Things you hadn't felt?" I echoed, my voice rising. "You mean excitement? Passion? Because you could have told me. You didn't have to turn to someone else." Sophie broke down, sobbing. "I didn't want to hurt you, David. I didn't know how to fix what was wrong between us." I stood there, staring at her, my mind racing. This wasn't just about her feelings. This was about betrayal on a level I never expected from the woman I thought I knew so well. But it wasn't just Sophie's fault, was it? I couldn't help but wonder, what had gone so wrong in our marriage that she felt the need to find comfort in someone else? The days that followed Sophie's confession were some of the hardest of my life. I tried to wrap my mind around everything, to make sense of where we had gone wrong. But the more I thought about it, the more questions I had. Who was Peter? Why hadn't she mentioned him before? And why now, after months of hiding the truth, was she finally coming clean? It was time to get some real answers. I hired a private investigator. It wasn't something I had ever imagined doing, but I needed to know the full extent of Sophie's betrayal. I needed to know if there was more to the story than what she had told me. The investigator's report came back a week later, and what I found out shocked me to my core. Peter wasn't just some random guy from a work event. He was a married man, a successful lawyer with a family of his own, and their affair hadn't started 6 months ago, like Sophie had said. It had been going on for over a year. They had met through mutual friends, not work, and had been sneaking around ever since, meeting up in hotels and traveling together when they both said they were on business trips. I felt like I had been punched in the gut. Everything Sophie had told me was a lie, and it wasn't just her. It was Peter, too. He had a wife, kids, a life that he was hiding from, just like Sophie was hiding from me. But there was more. As the investigator dug deeper, he uncovered something I never saw coming. Sophie wasn't the only one keeping secrets. There was another layer to this betrayal that would turn my world upside down. The investigator found that Peter wasn't just involved with Sophie. He had been having multiple affairs. Sophie was just one of several women. But the real twist came when the investigator looked into Peter's background. Peter was no stranger to Sophie. In fact, they had a history that went back further than I ever knew. Sophie and Peter had dated briefly in college, years before we ever met. They had reconnected at a party, and that's when things reignited. The affair had been an emotional escape for Sophie from the routine of our marriage, but it was also a rekindling of something she had never let go of. I confronted Sophie with the new information. She was speechless at first, then furious that I had hired someone to investigate her. But I didn't care anymore. I needed to know the truth, and the truth was far worse than I had ever imagined. But there was still one more twist, and this one shattered me completely. In one of the last meetings with the private investigator, he mentioned something odd about Sophie's financials. He'd been looking at her accounts, trying to track down where she and Peter had been meeting. And then he found something. For the last 2 years, Sophie had been quietly siphoning money out of our joint accounts into a separate account in her name. I hadn't noticed it because it was small amounts at first, just a few $100s here and there. But over time, it had added up. Tens of thousands of dollars were missing, all tucked away in this secret account. When I confronted Sophie about it, she didn't deny it. She admitted that she had been planning to leave me, to start a new life with Peter. She had been slowly saving up so that when the time came, she could walk away without needing anything from me. But Peter, it turned out, wasn't planning to leave his wife. Sophie had been living in a fantasy, thinking they could build a new life together, when in reality, Peter was just using her. The final blow came when Sophie packed her things and left. She took the money she had saved and disappeared. I didn't hear from her for months, and when I finally did, it was through her lawyer, filing for divorce. Sophie had been the love of my life, the person I thought I would grow old with. But in the end, she was nothing more than a stranger who had betrayed me in every way possible. I've moved on since then, rebuilt my life in ways I never thought I'd have to, but the scars of that betrayal will never fully heal.